Laboratory, Dr. Louise Gresham, Senior Fellow in Global Health Security at PAX Sapiens, and Dr. Ben Oppenheim, Senior Director at Ginkgo Bioworks, Inc., for a panel discussion with Foreign Policy's Allison Carlson on data, AI, and the next pandemic.
Great. That's quite an act to follow.
It is.
And quite a lot to pick up on, especially what she was just mentioning about the hooks. And Helen Clark said it so compellingly and profoundly, like picking up those hooks. And I think recognizing that there is still work to be done and different ways to leverage expertise and technology to understand where we're at, the nature of the threat, communicate that clearly, and what can and needs to be done now to address it and to really strengthen preparedness going forward. So much of the programming earlier today was focused on this intersection of climate and health. And we know that as our environment is changing, there are increasing stressors on the environment that are changing the pathogens. And pathogens are evolving from higher temperatures and a number of these stressors, both for humans and animals as well. And something that doesn't get much airtime, I think, in this landscape is the potential for zoonotic transfer and the risk that that presents. And so I'd really like to shine a light on that as part of this conversation, and also hear from all of you and the work that you're doing, the expertise that you have, and the organizations that you're coming from and how you're thinking about that. And as I was saying, I don't think it's well known. And so, Dr. Gresham, I'd like to start with you in terms of characterizing that risk landscape, and particularly what is the threat from zoonotic transfer?
I think you would have a good sense of the landscape if you even looked at the public health emergencies of international concern that we've dealt with, 2 times for Ebola, 2 times for Mpox. And you know, the FEICs have legal criteria, although we have seen that there are some logistic, political, and financial maybe swaying of a time period of a declaration of a FEIC. But even that uncertainty, I think, is a good word to describe this landscape of zoonotic threat. This deep entrenched uncertainty from clinicians who have to deal with Mpox patients, for example, and for local, national, and global public health practitioners. And I think it's also probably this uncertainty in the psyche of people when they try to understand zoonotic threat. But we understand the goals. The goals are to reduce this successive process of interactions between humans and animals that lead to a spillover or a jumping of a virus. And we have the same goals to reduce the numbers of cases of disease, not to just have this picture of zoonotic threat from a FEIC perspective, but certainly to have it from the perspective that if you can reduce the number of cases, you're going to reduce the likelihood of mutations. Therefore, you will not have a pathogen of greater virulence or one that is not effective with a vaccine. And the other goal is to be able to discern the difference between a natural occurrence of a spillover and a intentional biologic threat. This is very important to be able to distinguish that. It's harder to do when you have thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of cases to see if something is occurring out of season, has higher fatality rate, has a different dose response pattern. But let me end with the landscape in a positive way, unlike the moderator before us, saying something positive in that we do know a lot about the settings for spillover. We know live markets, wet markets. We know that we have zoos and fairs and abattoirs, the slaughterhouses, and the cattle ranches and the mink farms that have led to disease. And yet we think through regulation that could be moderated quite well, even with this pressure and uncertainty from the climate change perspective. And so these solutions, I think we have to be much more creative, like on mink farms. The mink farmers developed their own vaccine and implemented it. They did not want CDC on their property. And so there are ways to reduce this uncertainty and threat, and I'm happy to be joined by experts of Ben and Lauren on this. Thank you.
Thank you. To pick up on two things that you said to address the uncertainty, which I think is contributing to fear and a lack of knowledge and worry about this threat, but shining a light on it and understanding from increased surveillance, data science, and establishing an evidence base can help us discern, right, what that risk landscape looks like, where there are hot spots, where threats are emerging, and from what, to your earlier point, so that we can have greater clarity to then understand and discern what those possible responses, but also preparedness entails. And so, Dr. Charles, I'd like to turn to you when you're thinking about that expanded surveillance and ways to develop that evidence base. How are you working on that? And I also loved the optimism. That was the other thing I wanted to point out about the tools that are being developed to understand that risk threat and the threat landscape more holistically.
So I think to answer that question, it's best to take a step back and really just think about, where does disease come from? How does a disease outbreak? So to have disease, you need a susceptible host, like a human, a favorable environment, a infectious agent. That could be, in the case of a disease vector, like a mosquito, or a reservoir host, or a different type of host, like an animal in the case of zoonotic diseases. Without all three of these present, disease cannot occur. So we think about in nature, disease is naturally there. It keeps ecosystem balance. Pathogens are within their hosts and in the environment for years without causing problems. But how does disease outbreak? We think about the favorable conditions needed to have this disease outbreak. And we think about changes to host behavior, human behavior, susceptibility, changes to the environment, as we talked about earlier today, climate change and things like that, as well as changes in the pathogen itself, and potentially its disease vector or its reservoir host. So once you have more disease individuals than expected, disease outbreaks. So when I think about this and I apply it to my research, I see that to be able to really have early warning, prediction, understanding of what's going on before a human gets sick, we need to take this holistic One Health approach, where we're not just waiting till a human's sick, but we're looking at these other factors. We're looking at animals, which could be your pets or the wildlife in your backyard. We're looking at humans and societal factors that drive disease transmission. And we're looking at even food and agriculture and how that plays a role within our landscape. And by looking at it in this holistic way, we realize that there are so many signals out there that we can use to actually detect health threats. And so by applying greater surveillance, increasing the amount and the types of data that we are analyzing, we are able to actually get a handle on this. And luckily, this day and age, we have computational power capable, as well as artificial intelligence, which enables us to pull in all these types of data and actually make this approach plausible, and in a way we can do it.
Great, thank you. And picking up on that then, Dr. Oppenheim, with you, how are you then utilizing the evidence and forecasting to fill some of those gaps in the data and the evidence, but also using that then to try to mitigate this panic and neglect cycle that Helen Clark was referencing as well?
Yeah, that panic and neglect cycle is really fundamental. And it's driven not just by amnesia and the kind of pressure to move on to the next policy problem of the day. It's driven fundamentally by a lack of data. We're asking policymakers to make enormous investments in surveillance systems and response capacity and preparedness, and we're asking them to make those investments under conditions of deep uncertainty about when they'll be used and what they'll be used for, what impact they'll have. So a lot of the work that we do, some of the work that we do, focuses on trying to really build out the evidence base on the risk that faces us, specifically through quantifying the likelihood of seeing pandemics like COVID-19, like pandemic influenza, estimating the frequency and the severity of those events. We actually have a paper coming out in Disease Control Priorities led by my colleague Nita Madhav. It's very long, but I recommend it highly. And it sets out some estimates that we think can guide both the level of investment and the urgency of investment. And to give just one brief example, oftentimes when we talk about COVID, we talk about it as a once-in-a-century pandemic or once-in-a-century phenomenon. And it sort of makes sense, right? It happened about 100 years after 1918, but that is just a statistical quirk, right? It could have happened in any given year. All the conditions are always present, some being amplified, some being depressed. Our estimates, and you don't have to take our word for it, there are other scholars using different techniques who land in a pretty similar place. Our estimates suggest about a 50% chance of a pandemic the size of COVID-19 occurring within the next 25 years. So a coin toss, basically. And that coin is being tossed every day, every month, every year. And so from our perspective, the urgency is to take that coin toss seriously and to make data-driven investments, both, again, about the scale of financing needed to support surveillance and response, and, again, the urgency to make those investments now.
I really love the way you characterized that and broke it down, and I think it's a little bit of myth busting, right? Because I do think that is incredibly prevalent, that there is this notion out there that it was once in 100 years, and we have plenty of time before we have to worry about something like that again. And I love the way that you characterized that. And when you think about kind of mitigating this panic neglect cycle, and also the need for developing the evidence base, but also sharing that evidence base, how are you thinking about that in terms of enabling and fostering greater transparency in what you're finding? I know you referenced the paper, which absolutely we should all read, but also I imagine that there is some reticence about sharing some of the data and outbreaks where they occur for fear of backlash or other potential consequences, real or perceived, from that. And so I'm curious how you are all thinking about that in your work and how to foster that greater transparency and systematic sharing of the evidence so that more people can be informed and that data can inform the work that they're doing for preparedness.
Well, I would give an example of regional disease surveillance. And there are regional disease surveillance networks in the Middle East, Southeast Asia. A new one that was launched in February by Dame Harries at the UK Health Security is the Pan-European Network for Disease Control. And I say that, not that I don't understand that all disease starts locally, but when it comes to sharing and creating value, we find it very important that people are able to, in a context, whether it's a cultural context, a financial context, or even capabilities context, for people to be able to come together and say, perhaps we could have a joint protocol for an investigation of H1N1 so that you don't have to cull 1 million chickens. Maybe you only have to cull 50. Because we're sharing this protocol, same data, standardized data, norms, and people are acting very much at the same time across the system and are able to visualize the data. And that data to them, Allison, has so much more value than data that they don't understand. And I say they, as an epidemiologist, I mean me. I have been in that place where I am given so much data, so many predictions, but if I don't have the context or the value, will I really be able to make a good decision, a rigorous decision, or it may be one that would cost me my job decision?
Yeah.
Do you want to pick
in
up on
addition to that, I feel that very strongly, and we have found that through bringing stakeholders together, not just the data providers, but also scientists that are doing the research and that are going to be using the data, to sit down all together and really think about, what is the importance of data sharing? Why are we doing this? What are the obstacles we have to overcome, as well as what data do you even have? I have seen so many misunderstanding of what type of data others have. It's crazy, but once you realize this is what we have, this is what we're willing to share as well. You don't have to share everything. There are certain things that can help others for just basic understanding of a signal that can be very helpful, as well as just thinking about what types of data would be useful to that person, what type of analysis would be useful to that organization, and then what does a collaboration look like? Really starting with those basic things helps to build up that trust in that sort of collaborative spirit to actually enable these things to occur.
So I think this question of trust is really fundamental. And so in our work, we build and run operational disease surveillance programs with a number of countries around the world. And many of these are located at travel hubs, where lots of humans moving very quickly through space, and their potential kind of foci for outbreaks and for disease to spread. We think, as a matter of principle, it's deeply important for the countries to own their data, own their samples. That's how we want to operate. And we want to create positive incentives for them to share that information on a routinized basis, right? Not after an emergency strikes, but on a daily basis, to have these nodes communicate with each other and bilaterally or multilaterally share disease surveillance data to build up that level of trust, so that when things become politically tense or difficult, the mechanisms for communication and collaboration are there. They don't have to be built from scratch when it's hardest to build.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? And I'm really curious about changing incentive structures. And so when you're thinking about that, how would you approach that, and how can that be shifted and adjusted to really incentivize that greater sharing?
It's a really good question. So we're grappling with this, I'll say, actively every day. And maybe I can answer it in two ways. I think at the kind of macro level, countries are rightly worried that they will be punished for doing the right thing and reporting an outbreak or reporting a pathogen. They'll be subject to travel or trade bans. And we think that we need to fundamentally invert the incentive structure to report outbreaks. There are financial mechanisms that have been under debate to do this. For example, like contingent capital, it could be released if a country reports a pathogen. And I think the problem that solves is not so much the money problem, like countries obviously need capital to respond to outbreaks. It solves the trust problem that maybe they'll actually get it done. And so if the international community of other countries have confidence that an outbreak will be contained, then maybe the country that's doing the reporting, that's stepping up and doing the right thing, won't be subjected to those kind of punitive measures. So that's one kind of lever we can pull. The other one that I mentioned earlier is really just establishing kind of routinized data sharing, where countries kind of see operational value in their own public health programs on a daily basis, like as they get used to sharing and used to seeing incremental value. We'll build up muscle memory about how to do this well.
I'd love to pick up on that and spend the last few minutes building on that idea of new and innovative models, changing incentive structures, and how we can utilize the expertise to then inform decision makers, policy makers, and really get beyond what have heretofore been some of those sticking points or controversies or limitations in that. And so, also in the spirit of ending on a positive note, would love to hear from each of you in the last few minutes that we have, what is exciting you about that and what you foresee as being transformational in getting beyond some of those sticking points and thinking about the approach to this work a little bit differently. So, Lauren, I'll turn to you.
Sure.
And then
Louise. At the national lab where I work, Pacific Northwest National Lab, we have an approach called AI-driven One Health Security, where One Health Security really means that the health and security of humans, animals, the environment, plants, are all interconnected. And with this sort of approach, we have been able to really play upon, one, expanding our surveillance, our situational awareness beyond just humans. Extremely important. It opens up so many avenues for earlier detection of disease. Two, the ability to apply these AI technologies to advance and speed up early warning, mitigation, detection, all of these different components. And lastly, the technology is there for secure and restricted data sharing, as well as pulling in real-time surveillance data. But the issue has been that collaboration and trust, which is this big issue that we're talking about. And that is one we really need to work on, because without it, it's just not going to happen.
Louise?
Sure. I'm here representing Pax Sapiens, which is funded by the Arsenault Family Foundation. And Marcel committed during President Biden's COVID summit in 2021 funds for pandemic prevention. And I mention that because this type of support for me personally is key as we translate these ideas that we have so passionately. And for us, we are very much supporting a high-level panel with politically influential people to look at pandemic risk, to look at the drivers, to understand the science more, so that these AI complex predictive models make more sense to people. The second thing I would like to see, Allison, the last one, is I would like to see this cycle broken where countries have to wait for global data to take action. I think their ability to do that at the local country level is key, and I believe that can happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. And Ben, I'll finish with you. How do you see that being broken, and how do you see a more regionally led, locally led approach?
Well, I think some of the experiments that we're involved in and we're kind of seeing develop around the world with complex networks of countries and disease surveillance programs sharing are incredibly inspiring. Like it's really good work. And it opens up the possibility of layered surveillance systems that are data-driven, are responsive. There's a lot to build to bring this to life, but there's a lot to build on in terms of progress to date. And I want to pick up as well on something Louise mentioned about the potential to really advance the science. So COVID was a horrendous catastrophe. It also catalyzed in a very deep way a kind of level of scientific commitment and dialogue that we haven't really seen in this field before. So I am incredibly optimistic about our potential to begin to aggregate, systematize, to look across really disparate fields that all kind of understand components of that disease transmission process that can ignite pandemics, to add that up and to build something for our community more like analogous to what the IPCC has done for climate, to chart a path forward, to aggregate evidence, to keep score, to tell us how we're doing, mitigating the drivers and the push factors that are impelling pandemics. So I'm many miles to go, but I'm highly optimistic we can get there together.
Yes, and also the energy, the passion that all of you demonstrate. I was mentioning to all of you, joining you in the green room, as you all came together, you could feel all of the excitement about the opportunity before us and the way that you can harness each other's insights and experience to really make progress and move this forward in ways that heretofore have not. So thank you for sharing that wisdom and insight with us, and again for being here.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.